Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artists Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere.
If you wouldn't mind again, your name for the record.
My name is Jason Smith.
All right. And Jason, you're here because you are like a really important part for 28 years?
28 years.
Of the New Bedford music scene, greater New Bedford music scene. And let's explore the beginnings of that. You moved here 28 years ago
I came here to go to grad school for ceramics at UMass Dartmouth, actually. And kind of funny because in agreeing to go to grad school, I'm like, okay, I'm going to buckle down. I always played some music during undergrad, even though my major was in fine arts. And so when I go into grad school, I was like, all right, I better buckle down. I'm sure I'm not going to meet any musicians in this new city I'm moving to. And after being here about, I got here in late August, 1994. And definitely before the end of September, I had gone out to a club downtown. It was one of the few bars that was open. It was like Crickets was one of the few bars, and I think the Blue Moon was the other one. And really, other than that, there wasn't anything going on downtown, particularly in the evening. But anyway, I went to this place called Crickets Club and saw basically the proto version of a band that would become to be known as Pumpkinhead Ted, which consisted of Tom Short on saxophone and flute and vocals, Johnny Neiman on guitar and vocals, and at that time it was Michael Lavoie on bass. And I went to go see them, and they were pretty cool. They had an eclectic taste in music, not unlike mine. They had another guy named Doug Tuxworth who would sit in on saxophone on a few songs, and they also brought a conga with them, and I had played some percussion in undergrad. So I asked to sit in on a song or two, and they let me, and then mostly because of the relentless and obnoxious demeanor of my fellow grad students who began to chant, "Let Jason play, let Jason." I played a few songs on guitar, probably a couple Paul Simon songs or something like that. And so that started what became, I would not officially join Pumpkinhead Ted as a member until I think February of '95, but that began me sitting in and playing with those folks, which is now going on 28 years now. So
yeah. And music before you arrived?
So music before I arrived, I started playing guitar when I was I think I got my first guitar for Christmas. It was a BC Rich custom New Jersey model with a through neck. It had full 24 frets. It was quite a beast.
Sharp, pointy guitars?
Yeah, not the super sharp, pointy ones, but it had like a crazy cutaway because it had the full 2-octave fretboard.
Yeah.
Not the ones that are super angular.
They made some cool things.
They did.
Jeremy had a Mockingbird. It sounded like everything.
Yeah, like with the through neck too, you could do really nasty stuff. You couldn't do it as far as bending the neck and stuff like that. But I actually sold that. That's a whole other story. I sold that to a friend of mine who, because I had switched really over to acoustic guitar by like my second year of undergrad, and I had the guitar laying around. A friend of mine was in a hard rock group, and he was like. I was like, I'll let you, buy it, and I think I sold it to him for like $175, which was definitely undervalued. He turned 3 weeks later. He turned around and traded in for like an Epiphone Les Paul, and got like $350 on the trade. And I was like, dude, I wouldn't have stood if I knew that was going to happen. So it's been hard for me to part with guitars since then, actually. But anyway, long story short. Played some guitar in a punk group in high school. That was, I don't know that we ever even, I don't think we ever had a drummer. We had like a singer. I played guitar. Another guy who was playing keyboards. I got to, with the keyboard player singing, I played at my senior prom sat in with the live band that was there. They let me use their guitar, and their bass player and drummer sat in and we played Pretty Vacant by the Sex Pistols, which was my first time ever performing in front of people. And though it was very nervous and very nerve-wracking, I did enjoy it. And so when I got to undergrad, I went to Miami, University of Ohio, which is outside of Cincinnati. Ended up forming a punk band with some of the people I was in my freshman dorm with, even though the school was relatively a conservative college, as many goes. There's a bunch of kind of more freaky people in my particular corridor. So several of us, and then a couple of guys who were from town, ended up forming a band, a punk band, and we ended up played like at an end of the year festival at our outside of our undergrad dorm. That band had a lot of names as we were trying to figure out what we were. Most of them are inappropriate. I won't say them here.
That's a
ironically enough, ironically enough, we ended up the name we settled on and that we performed under was called the Johnny Depps, but which is almost inappropriate in and of itself.
Still pretty inappropriate. Getting more inappropriate by the day.
We played. I had written a couple goofy punk songs for that band, and we played like some Ramones covers, and we must have done a few other things as well. I can't remember everything.
So was that the beginning of original music for you, of writing songs?
Yeah, that was after a harrowing experience on New Year's Eve, which I won't get into the details. Just as a kind of only loosely based on my experience, and by no means exactly, but it just more out of the rhyming of the title worked. I wrote one of our favorite songs we performed, which was one of the ones I wrote, which was called PCP on New Year's Eve. Only loosely based on facts, as I was saying. But that was the beginning of original music for me. So interestingly enough, for me in undergrad, there's a lot of us who were all our freshman year. Everybody had a group of friends who were all musicians. Most of them had been playing a little bit in high school. We were all roughly on the same level. I was like, some of them had a little bit more understanding of theory than I did. Like literally, wasn't until I got to undergrad I'm like, oh, this is a G chord in first position. Like I didn't know that when I was first playing. I mean, I know I'm not the first person to say this, but like what I would have been able to do with like YouTube when I was in high school, like because there were no resources. You know?
But don't you think this is interesting? You know what? This is the beginning of the digression, I think, right? Because now we're really talking. We get the backstory, right? But I feel like that kind of shaped us in a way.
Yeah. No, I agree.
In my town, there was a record store, and you got what they had.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so, like, whatever was in the record store was really formative to, like, who you became as a musician. And also, like, whoever that influential person behind the counter of the record store was. It kind of moved us. Like, I don't think if there was a YouTube, I would have been as hardcore of like Dead Kennedys fan or something.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I don't necessarily disagree with that. But from a strictly, I just always felt early on I was in a music pedagogical desert as far as I just had there was no input. I wasn't taking any formal lessons, and it was all really based on what I could figure out on my own, which was, for whatever reason, though I have a good ear, in particularly rhythmically, it's only been through really intensive playing that I've developed my ear. So like hearing, like sometimes it was early on, it was hard for me to tell the difference between a minor and a major chord. I could get it was a B, but is this minor or major? I'm not even sure.
Was there any amount of that, you think, in the 90s that was like, I feel like I remember there was like a really like art brute kind of sense to music in general, where we were making things where it was like, I don't want any of the rules. I don't want any of the theory. I'm afraid that'll blunt the knife that I'm trying to cut with.
And much of like, particularly the early punk stuff that I was writing with my friends, it was very much like that. DIY aspect of music is that you don't know what the rules are, you're not bound by them, and so that you don't, that's what I always liked about listening to some of the early punk rock from the mid 80s, some of the I remember nothing quite prepared me for when I heard like Bad Brains, I think when I was like 15 or 16 in like 80s, probably like 86 or something, and it was just like, what? Like, and that, like, all these, just half-step movements with bar chords and stuff that was really, had a very particular sound that wasn't like what anything else that was coming out at the time.
And if you had YouTube then, you could have seen him doing flips at the same
time. Yeah, I know, exactly.
I'm going to make sure that this...
Yeah, go ahead.
It's just silliness, but I feel more comfortable.
Yeah, so if you can see what's going on, absolutely.
Sorry.
No, I hear you. No, that's interesting. So, anyway, what I was starting to get at when I went on my YouTube tangent was that I felt like early on a lot of my friends, and this goes back to maybe that my having a good rhythmic ear but not a really great harmonic ear, which also made it hard for me to learn new stuff on the guitar neck, that a lot of my friends seemed to get a lot better than I was in the first few years of college. And so that they all got a lot better and started forming their own bands, and I was kind of like struggling just to like maintain some musical integrity with what I was trying to do. But I think that had a huge impact on that I wanted to always be better than I was, and I typically, and it's one of the things I think I've been really lucky with my entire musical career starting back in undergrad then, was that I've always had the great fortune of being surrounded by musicians who are better than I was. Because when you're surrounded by people who are better than you, you have to rise to the occasion, not always successfully, but the challenge is always there. So whereas, I won't name any names, and I won't bash anybody of my old friends by name because most of them are still playing music themselves. I feel like a lot of those guys, when they got good and by their early 20s, a lot of them haven't developed that much from where they got good at that age, and a lot of what they're playing sounds kind of the same. For me, because I always felt like I had to work a lot harder than they were to get where I was going, when I got pretty good, it wasn't good enough, and I also wanted to play different kinds of music, and so that also challenged with levels of technique and skill that wasn't just about trying to sound like the next Jane's Addiction or Smashing Pumpkins or a lot of what my friends' bands were sounding like back in the day,
So you started out in a lot of punk rock kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then Pumpkinhead is more acoustic. Well, it's really eclectic. Acoustic.
So actually, so the last part of my music career in college really started when I switched over probably around my sophomore year from electric guitar to acoustic guitar. I actually got to a point by the early 90s where I was really, even though I still appreciated a lot of the old harder music that I had grown up with, I'd kind of stopped listening to hard rock and really had, this really came out from, here's the other part of my musical journey, goes back to the vastness and quality of my parents' record collection. So when I started going home, particularly when you're a teenager and you're getting into the bands you're getting in as a teenager, it's often in rebellion of whatever the music you were brought up with. Right. And so I didn't, particularly by the time I was a teenager, I was really into the music that I was in, and there was very little from what my parents exposed me to that I was open to at that point, and I was very anti it. And some of it I had never really appreciated even as a kid. There was some stuff my parents listened to that I liked, but a lot of it was just, okay, whatever. But then once I got to undergrad and I started expanding my own experiences, when I'd come back home on like Christmas vacation or over the summertime or whatever, I'd start going through their vinyl, and I remember hearing something or from back in the early childhood memories, and that got me because my parents were very much kind of old folkies. My dad was collected 78s of kind of like early doo-wop, proto like vocal groups from like the late 40s through to the mid 50s was his 78 collection, and then they had like everything from Benny Goodman to Willie Nelson to Martin Bogan and Armstrong to Steve Goodman, David Bromberg, and Hot Tuna. So like Bromberg, Hot Tuna, Doc Watson records from my dad's collection, particularly my last couple years of undergrad, really like, and I was like, oh my God, if I could ever play like that, I would just be so thrilled with myself. And so I began very haltingly to learn some fingerstyle technique a la Hot Tuna and stuff like that, although it took me several years to get to anywhere where I could actually play it that way. So those last couple of years of undergrad, me and my roommate at the time, who I wasn't very good at playing lead, but I had gotten pretty good at playing rhythm guitar and I could sing okay. And he could kind of noodle along relatively well, better than most of our other friends on acoustic with what I was doing. So we kind of formed a duo. And so we did, I think we did eventually learn how to play like Hesitation Blues by Hot Tuna, but we had written a few of our own songs, some instrumental, some with vocals, but we covered kind of a lot of weird stuff. Some of our friends' hard rock songs acoustically, some other stuff from like everything from David Bowie to Paul Simon to Neil Young and stuff like that. And we would just kind of pull from whatever we liked. But that kind of got me into the more acoustic, folky, kind of American roots music, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so with that sensibility, still kind of punk rock roots, and then that other stuff that had been really my earlier exposure growing up, brought when I came and fell in with Pumpkinhead Ted in New Bedford, kind of brought all of that stuff to bear. Although interestingly enough, when I started playing with Pumpkin, I was strictly a percussionist. I was not playing guitar for the first several years, or maybe only on a song or two here and there. So.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to talk about, like, getting back to like kind of things that have roots, because honestly, for the most part, the people that I have, just a certain number of people that I'm interviewing. There's a number of different interviewers.
Yeah.
And I kind of picked almost all people who have some connection to something that I think of as like a traditional music.
Yeah.
And we were talking about fingerpicking blues and some like, Doc Watson, so like Appalachian old time and stuff like that. But then, bringing it around full circle past Pumpkinhead.
Yeah.
I mean, you're still doing Pumpkinhead, obviously.
Absolutely.
But to the Hot Club Cheese Rolls.
Yes.
And that music, I mean, it's out of jazz, and we can cite who it is that's like, the founding fathers of it, but it really functions as a traditional music.
It does in many ways. It's probably more, unless I think you grow up in fact, the Sinti tradition of gypsy people who live in and around Northern Europe, because obviously the gypsy tradition more in Southern Europe is the flamenco, where it's basically the classical guitar hand strumming versus the plectrum picking, and it's kind of the North Europe, Southern Europe divide in gypsy music. Unless you grew up in those communities where it is everybody's living, breathing that stuff, I think unlike at least many, if not all, traditional music, at least for me, perhaps other people would have a different experience, like there was a requirement of some like jazz theory and things that that was something that, it was kind of the vehicle by which I began to learn that stuff, was because like I don't know how or why any of this stuff is working the way it does, and it's particularly when but I mean, I would say some of the fast bluegrass, like Doc Watson stuff I heard early on was even like this, but gypsy jazz even more so, that there's the structure can get that's there, if you listen for it, can get lost behind the virtuosity that is going on this kind of whoever is playing the music. And so for a long time, all of that was just almost impenetrable for me to like, I have no idea even where to start to like begin to learn some of this stuff. So for me, it almost, I mean, the gypsy jazz thing nearly happened by accident, because it was as likely I wouldn't have gone that route. When I finished, so that, adding to the backstory a little bit, after I got done with my Master's of Fine Arts at UMass, I worked in the field for another 3 years. When I was finishing my written thesis, I worked for my former professor, Chris Guston, who has, at the time, had a architectural tile factory down in South Dartmouth. And so I was basically kind of running his shop after a year or two for a few years while I was writing my thesis. And I was watching him, who was already a luminary in the ceramics field and also a much better businessman than I will ever be, like having a hard time breaking out of the red with his tile business. And I was going, what am I going to do? If he's having a hard time making money at this, who do I think I am? Yeah. So I ended up, my dad's a college professor and my mom was a special education teacher. So I ended up going back to school and got a master's in education with a certificate in special education. So long story short, when I, for graduation, for finishing my graduate school stuff, like I think the year before or even 6 months before there, I can't remember if my dad turned me onto the article or if I saw the article and then showed it to him. But it was an article about Jorma Kaukonen's guitar camp outside of Athens, Ohio. And, my dad being the person who turned me on the hot tuna, and then the idea of like, wow, you could go down and study potentially with Jorma. And so he had basically said, you don't have to do it immediately, and obviously if there's classes filled up right now, but for your graduation, I'm going to send you to a class you want.
That's an awesome present.
So yeah, so it was an awesome present. So my initial thought was I was going to go study with Jorma, and really try to maybe master that finger style idea. But the more I thought about what I was doing, there are two things going on. One was a lot of what I was beginning to do more guitar work in Pumpkinhead Ted at that point, and a lot of it was more comping chords and single note lead than that more kind of traditional finger style thing. Mm-hmm. And not that you can't make that work in a larger ensemble, but there's a more straight ahead idea of, at least from my own musical thinking in my own brain, of in a 5-piece ensemble of comping chords and playing lead than it is about kind of creating a texture of that, because the finger picking really becomes a lot more like a ragtime piano kind of an idea, rather than like here's some chords and here's a line that goes over top of it.
Phenomenal sound man to make that work in a rock band in any setting that's live too.
Yeah. And so it's not always, it doesn't always, at least in my own brain, I wasn't seeing the translation immediately. And then the other thing that came into my head was that I was a little afraid of going to study with Jorma and there being kind of the Icarus too close to this, like, was such a luminary, like the way he loomed in my own understanding of what I wanted to do in playing guitar, that I was a little afraid of just being like starstruck and not actually getting what I wanted to get out of it. Mm-hmm. And so those two thoughts kind of made me think, well, what are other classes being offered? And I happened to look down, and there was a gypsy jazz class. And I was like, you know what? That would be really cool. Because I'd always think it was probably about halfway through. Actually, I know the first time I ever heard gypsy jazz was a guy who was a guitar player in the first actual band I played in college. I was a percussionist in that band, but he was a townie. They had an apartment next to ours where I was living my sophomore year in college, and he had a Borelli Langreen vinyl from like when Borelli was like 12 or 13 years old, which is how old he was, probably in 1990, 91, whenever it was. But that was the first time I ever heard it, and it reminded me of some of the swing and classical jazz that my parents had played, but adding that level of kind of string instrument virtuosity. I had also, during my freshman year, for the first time heard Friday Night in San Francisco with McLaughlin and Al Di Meola and Paco de Lucia, and I remember like being like, I didn't know you could make acoustic guitars do like that. Like I only thought like metal electric guitars could be played that fast and that technically, and so I remember that like, there's a whole other thing to potentially this. And so then when I heard gypsy jazz, like I heard some of that earlier swing stuff my parents listened to, but with that a kind of a level of for lack of a better term, there's a gypsy, Middle Eastern, North African kind of melodic sense that isn't Western, and that it makes it sound really kind of interesting. At least that was my exposure. So bringing it back around, I was like, well, having some kind of gypsy jazz ideas under what I'm doing in Pumpkin, I think would translate easier than trying to learn to do the Yorma stuff better than I already could, which was okay at best, probably. So that was my introduction, and I had the great fortune of, because I just signed up for the class without really knowing who the person I was going to be studying with. And it turned out for about 8 months before I ended up studying with him, I had been listening to him, but without really knowing it. I went and caught, I think it was in 2009, David Grisman Quintet played down at the Narrows. And so I caught them, and there had just been a recent kind of personnel shift. So there were some younger guys in the band. So I can remember the guitar player's name. He's from Colorado. He's really good, though. He'll come to me in a second. But anyway, they had, of the stuff they were selling, they had a live CD that had been recorded a couple years before. And the guitar player on that record turned out to be this guy, Frank Vignola, which was who I had ended up signing up for the class for 6 months before. But since I had signed up, I had forgotten who the guy's name was. And then I'd been listening to this guy. And literally it was the night before I was going to go show up at Fur Peace Ranch to study with him. I made the connection with... it's the guy I've been listening to on this recording for the last. That's what. Oh my god! And so
he's the guy too.
And he is the guy. So, so what I really Frank is awesome in that I don't know of any more of a technical. I don't know of anyone who knows more guitar extended chords. Like there's nothing he hasn't already played or already know. And even though with all of that kind of technical expertise, his teaching approach is still really much that, the people who really learned all this stuff didn't know the theory and didn't know the stuff. And so the pioneers of like Django, Reinhardt, Les Paul, like a lot of these early jazz guitar pioneers were doing it from a very basically traditional kind of experience. So... So I took the class at Fur Peace Ranch with Frank Vignola back in 2010. And so then I started to try to learn, for the next 5 years or so, I was mostly learning the repertoire, trying to learn these jazz songs and like, oh my God, what the hell is this chord? I've never had to play this chord before, and just getting some of these new techniques and new positions under my fingers without, actually I should leave out technique, because when I was learning the kind of that was also when you and I and Rick Smith were doing the Chunka Chunka. And that was kind of the beginning of kind of starting to get those songs under my belt. But a lot of it was learning to play those chords in those positions, but with my old guitar technique. I took another opportunity in 2016 to study with Frank again, this time out in Colorado, and rather than for a long weekend, it was for a whole week. And there were some other players who were involved in the instruction. Vinny Raniolo, his partner, frequently, as well as the great Finnish guitar player, Oli Soikli. But once I did that class, I realized if I wanted to be better at this and play this style in any sort of way, that the only way that was going to be happen was if I formed a band, basically.
Yeah.
Because if I can continue to like look at videos online, I can continue to mess around in my office room and noodle on, learn this stuff. But if I was going to actually try to play this music, I was going to actually have to start playing with people on a regular basis.
Right.
So that kind of, that kind of put me into the mind of let's form a group. I think I called you first.
Yeah. We did that.
And so and something I'm still thankful for of you, that you helped get the cheese roll off the ground back then. So I was also able to rope Barry Gross into kind of the early version of that.
Yeah.
And then also we had from a band that was up closer to Boston that used to come down here and play every once in a while. They're not together anymore, called Gumbo Diablo, but they did they were kind of a Gumbo Diablo was kind of a Zydeco fusion-y band. They did some Brazilian stuff too. But they had a accordion player named Ken Hyatt who was pretty good, and so I was able, at least for a while, to rope him in. His real love was Brazilian music, so he eventually, the commitment of having to learn and play gypsy jazz became a little bit much for him to continue with the group. But around the time he was getting ready to leave, we through I think playing with some bluegrass groups up in Boston, Barry ran into this guy, Mark Russell, who's now kind of, he and I are kind of the core unit, and we have bass players who kind of rotate through depending on who can make the gig. And I am always thank my lucky stars to have the great fortune of playing with somebody of the caliber of Mark Russell, because he can really blow, and again makes you rise to the occasion and really be on your toes and play at your best. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, thinking like outside of just the band, just like the camp, it's like probably just people playing with each other constantly outside.
Yes,
of classes,
well, that's
right?
If you've never done like a music camp or guitar camp, and obviously, like I'm lucky to have a day job in that I can, and us, my wife and I do not have any kids, which allows for at least a level of financial stability and flexibility that I know not everybody is, particularly if they've decided to do their art as their mainstay. That's doing something like a camp is not an easy thing to swing.
Right.
And so I'm always count my blessings and know that I'm fortunate what I've been able to experience in that way. But that is, if you ever have the opportunity to do something like that for whatever style of music or for whatever, I highly recommend it, only because it's like, I remember those days in college where, you know, either like you had a Tuesday or Thursday where there's only one class, or, you know, you had those freedom to not go to class if you decided not to, and you could like play music for 4 hours without ever really having to think about having to do anything else. And as an adult, that is is almost never happens. It's almost impossible. Even whether you have kids or not, it's like it's hard to put aside that kind of time. And I think that not that you without tons of practice, you can still obviously grow, but the more practice you have, I think obviously more time you're practicing your own instrument and more time you're rehearsing with people you play with, that's when you're going to get, you know, you're going to get better more quickly. So that opportunity to spend 3 or 4 days, or even better, a full 6 or 7 days, where, you know, minimum you're playing music with people for 6 hours. Sometimes it's closer to 12 or 14 if you're having a really, you know, you end up at somebody's back at their, you know, place where they're staying, or somebody's a townie, and you end up doing a jam session. Just being able to take in a huge amount of information, and then just spend that much time playing is just a huge just it's a gift, and it's so amazing.
Yeah, and I imagine where, like you were saying, it's a tradition, but it's not a tradition native to here.
Yeah,
that's almost like language immersion, where you go and it's like you study in the thing, like you would be studying your conjugation of verbs.
Yes,
but like all of a sudden here you are.
You're having to conjugate on the fly. Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's a great analogy, because you're also typically in those classes. There are people who are just learning the style. There are people who have got some of the repertoire under their fingers, but can't really get beyond that. Then you have some cats in the class who could be teaching it potentially, and so you get a huge variety. So it was actually that when I went to Colorado in 2016, it was one of the guys who was actually taking the class. Two of them. One of the guys was in Crested Butte, Colorado. One of the guys was a local gypsy jazz guy. He was actually also the emergency orthopedic surgeon for the local hospital, because it's a skiing resort. So he had to deal with lots of broken legs and arms and stuff like that. But they were both, I don't know, perhaps so was 6 years ago. I might now be approaching some of the level they were at already then, but that's when I first started to learn how much I was taking my kind of bad folk rock technique and trying to apply it so I was used to, if you learn in the kind of traditional American way of playing guitar, you mute with your palm
on the right,
on the pick hand. Almost all rock and roll is that way, and a lot of other.
I'm trying to imagine what another way to do this is now.
Well, that's in gypsy jazz, and it's even true. It's basically when playing single note or in gypsy jazz, you're doing it single note or strumming. But even Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan use what's called rest stop picking. It's also called gypsy picking in the where you're muting everything with your left hand. So you're gripping the chord quickly and then letting it go, but not bringing your fingers all the way off, so that you're pulsing here.
For stopping a note, or for just kind of dulling it?
For mostly for rhythm. So when you're chunking along. Okay. And so everything because these early gypsy jazz guitar players were having to compete with jazz instruments like horns and stuff that were loud. And early on there was little to no amplification for the guitars. They were having to figure out ways to make the instrument as loud as possible. And if you don't have a hand on the soundboard on the top of the box of the guitar, you're going to get a lot more sound and projection out of it. So everything developed from this muting with the left hand, and you kind of have this even single note, although it's a much smaller movement, but definitely when you're playing rhythm, it's kind of almost like, I've had it described to me, I think the best way is like if you had struck a match, you lit your cigarette, and then you were putting it out. It's that putting it out action, and so your wrist is kind of bent, but there's a lot of kind of shimmy and movement there, and that's where... so I was doing this kind of weird thing where I was, to create the sound that it sounded like to me, I was doing it in this weird way, but muting it with my palm, and they were like, no, that's not how you do this. You got to do it this way. And so that was a whole, it took me a good 3-4 months to get muting with my left hand. That's what and so that was a real kind of coordination, right hand, left hand thing that I had to kind of learn. So basically, since that 2016 class, I immersed myself much more in the actual technique of the style.
Do you feel like you lose any of the excitement knowing some of it?
A little, I think that's true of anything. Once you when I remember, learning gypsy jazz really improved my harmonic ear generally. So I remember one of my favorite Doc Watson guitar songs, and it's kind of a bluegrass instrumental. It's from the Will the Circle Be Unbroken sessions. Down Yonder, and it's a great interplay with Doc Watson on guitar and Vassar Clemens on violin. And I remember I heard that my whole life. And again, like that, where you're hearing like a level of virtuosity on the instrument, it makes what's technically going on kind of more opaque, because it's just like you're blown so much away by the artistry that it makes kind of getting into what's actually happening, I think, more difficult. It kind of cows you. And I remember I teach at a alternative high school in Attleboro, and I was driving home on 195 from work one day, and I often, if I'm listening to music in my car, I often have like my old iPod that's just on random, and I have literally everything from Joni Mitchell to Bad Brains, whatever, and it'll just go from song to song. And sometimes, I'm fast forwarding through a couple, and I was like, no, I'm not dealing with that right now. But anyway, Down Yonder came on, and it got to Doc's guitar part. And again, like after having learned a bunch of theory and harmony and learning all this stuff, his part came on. I was like, I know what he's doing. And so I hit the gas, like I literally sped up, got home, and was like, and like obviously I wasn't playing it as good as Doc, but like suddenly what had been just this obscure veil of virtuosity had been lifted, and like I could see the structure underneath it. So I think it's double-edged. I think there's a point at which where it's like, oh, that used to blow me away, and now it's like I know exactly what it is. Yeah. But then there's also what, from that understanding of what that knowledge is, it gives you like. So now when I listen to a lot of gypsy jazz now, and I can be like, oh, like I might not be able to play that lick, but I know exactly what he's doing, which 5-10 years ago was not true for me. So.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because, I mean, it's like, the thing that made me think that was, I remember reading this thing, I can't remember what book it was, but Mark Twain wrote a book that was like Life on the Mississippi or something like that. And I guess he studied, like, he was like an actual, like, riverboat worker for years. Yeah. And by the time he was done, he knew, like, every inch of the river, and he was like, I'm done with the Mississippi River. You know what I mean? But I think of, like, like, especially in music that's got, like, a traditional or an improvisational element, something that's participatory, where you're like in a conversation with somebody else. It's kind of infinite. You know what I mean? Like the river bends a different direction if somebody leans in a different way.
Absolutely. And I definitely would agree with that. And definitely the more people you can play with. Actually, one of the things I was from listening to the podcast you did with Ron, talking about how choosing kind of doing community playing versus gigging as a way forward for you that would be sane and make you kind of be satisfied and kind of your thing, that like that made me immediately think of like I should work more on trying to get more people in this area probably into the style, so just to add to the number of people I can potentially play with. And I've worked a little bit with I kind of had Mike Heffernan in training for a little while, among others.
It's interesting, too, because like you were saying, I mean, if you grew up listening to these chord changes where the circle of fifths is like normal to you, the way that like 1-4-5 is normal to us.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Then it wouldn't be weird, but like to get somebody into gypsy jazz is daunting in that like there's a lot of...
You have to, and that's part of probably what has kept me from doing it more, is that without I kind of have to find the people who are already interested. Because if you're not already interested, I can't give you that interest, Or
you have to work backwards, right? You get guys who are playing the bop stuff that's like still mystifying to me.
Yeah,
where, like,
exactly.
That's the same thing that you were talking about before. Like, I hear it and I go like, I like this because I have no clue what's happening. You know, it's like a place where I can turn off.
Exactly.
I don't hear the chord changes.
Yeah.
I don't, what that guy just did sounded wicked cool. No idea what it was.
Exactly. Exactly.
But those guys could play gypsy jazz.
Yeah, too. Exactly. No. Well, that's what's funny. Conversations I had when Mike Lavoie, before I can't believe he is retired from music, at least for the time being.
Is he really?
Yeah. He took, don't want to get too far into this. He had supported himself for 25 years from like the age of 22, just gigging.
Yeah.
Like he didn't take students. He just gigged.
Yeah.
And he was getting a little burnout, and then the pandemic hit, and he was like, if there was ever a time to go straight, like this is it. So I called him up for a gig. I had done a gig with him in October, and I think I called him up for another one I called him up in December for like January, and he's like, I stopped playing. And that was like January 2021. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he's such a great player, you know? Yeah. So everybody who knows this is always like, we got to get Mike playing again. He's just too gifted.
Just think of that as so much a part of who you are as a person that like it makes you wonder like that happening with the pandemic. I'm not speculating on Mike, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
but
exactly.
As a guy that you like and care about, who you know as a player, you think like, oh, like that piece of his soul, we got to polish that thing off again,
no,
you know
exactly. I mean, anyway, this was a conversation I was having with Lavoie, because he's much more versed in the bop stuff than in the gypsy jazz, and he kind of liked sitting in with the cheese roll when he had the opportunity, because he was like, oh, this is a different approach to some of the stuff. But one his point is that a lot of the bop guys in Django got to the same place from two completely different arcs as far as the kind of the dissonant note choice and stuff like that. They really almost came to the same place from two completely different traditions, which I think is really cool. And it's also cool, like Django got to play with like Dizzy and people before he died as well.
I love that with improvisers, talking with improvisers about why they did what they did.
Yeah.
You know, I found like in college, I came from like more of a bluegrass background where I was always thinking of like what I was doing in relation to a chord all the time.
Yeah.
And then like, you know, guys I knew who were playing like, who were like more like whatever, like maybe they learned how to play like rock and roll solos or whatever, and they were given a scale early on.
Yeah,
and they're like, use this scale.
Yeah.
I never thought of a scale, you know what I mean? But like you said, like we end up sort of playing the same notes.
Yeah,
for two totally different reasons.
Traditions, two different reasons, yeah.
But then being able to communicate that, you know, it's then you think differently about what's possible, you know.
And that's what makes playing music so freaking amazing, no matter what you're doing with it. To kind of bring it around further, I think it was former member of Pumpkinhead Ted, great guitar player, mandolin player, banjo player in his own right, Patrick Pounds.
Oh yeah.
He told me the joke right around the time I first started learning to play gypsy jazz, which was that gypsy jazz, it's just the first 20 years are the hardest. But I've thought about that, and now that I'm 12 years in, I'm more than halfway through that first 20-year really hard part. And for the first time, really, since like I said, it was like I started it back in 2010, and 2016 was when I really kind of dedicated myself to the style. I found myself in the last 6 months to a year, not that I'm going to drop it, but whatever. But I've, for the first time, been like, I want to try now what I know with this knowledge, and I want to kind of think about some of this differently. And actually, the guitar player I've been listening to more than anybody else recently. I got a great opportunity to go catch him. I think it was in November at the Narrows. It was Julian Lage.
Oh, yeah.
And for me, at least, particularly, like, I already enjoyed his playing from stuff I'd listened to, but going to see him live, I actually got to do a master class with him for about a half hour, 45 minutes before, with like a group of 10 or 15 of us before the show at the Narrows. Like Julian has all of those technical skills and the knowledge and the jazz acumen under his belt.
Right.
But you don't, when you hear a lot of the stuff he plays, it just sounds like free expression, you know, like, and whimsical, like fun, like I'm having fun, I'm having a sense of humor. That's something I think a lot of jazz, particularly more contemporary jazz, loses a bit often, is that people are so serious about how far they're extending their chord or how many 30-second notes they're going to play. It becomes
music for musicians.
Athletic almost. Whereas there's, like, I feel like there's a fun in having a sense of humor, which I think is always really from early jazz. It's always been about freedom and having fun, not necessarily just about how clever or obscure I can make this particular phrasing or whatever it is you want. So I got to ask Julian a question at the end of the master class, and so what I asked him was, what I appreciate about your playing is that it's obvious you're having fun, and there's a sense of humor and a whimsicalness to it. And I was wondering, is that something that just comes from the person you are and your how you approach improvisation, or is there a way to practice that? And his response I thought was interesting, because he said, he's like, oh, no, you can absolutely practice that, except that the catch is that what's going to have a sense of humor isn't going to be the same from one style of music to the next. He was like, what's going to be funny in a heavy metal song is not going to be funny in a bop or a traditional song or whatever else. So what I liked about that is that there's no hard and definite, this is how you're going to do it, but you got to like think about what is funny for what I'm doing and what's going to be. I mean, for me, I think a lot of it can come from quoting other, I think that's a really fun way to throw a sense of humor, is quoting melodies from other songs.
That early punk rock, like, it'd just be noise, right?
Yeah.
Like just inserting in like a random, like shocking, like, here's a thing.
But yeah, so that's kind of where I've been thinking about recently, in that one of the things that I've done over the last, basically since the pandemic, that's kind of also moved me in that kind of somewhat newer direction, is that for the first time, and really since I was in high school, probably, I've kind of come back to electric guitar. I got over the beginning of the pandemic, I turned 50, and I realized that for my 50th birthday that I was going to be like in my house alone and not going to go see a show. I'm not going to go travel. I'm just going to be, I'm like, this sucks. So I'm like, all right, I'm buying a Telecaster. That's it. So I ended up buying a Telecaster, and although I've mellowed out in the last 6-8 months, went down the guitar effect rabbit hole for a little while.
I don't think I've ever been down that hole.
Don't go if you don't, unless you're really feeling it. There's no need to go down there. Really not, but easy way to spend lots of money in a short period of time. But nonetheless, that's been fun in being able to take some of the, but I think what has, like, by the time I was beginning to play gypsy jazz, I knew some scales. I wasn't like super versed, but I had some stuff under my fingers in a few different boxes and whatever. And I've certainly expanded the knowledge of those things and having those under my fingers. But in a lot of ways, I read a cool biography of Django Reinhardt. Like, Django didn't even know scales necessarily. Didn't really think in scales, and thought musically really in two different ways, through arpeggios and through chromatics. And if you listen to his playing, you realize there isn't a lot of modal-based stuff. It's really playing with the notes and the chord, and then connecting dissonant chord connections through chromaticism and stuff like that. And for those of us in the listening audience, arpeggios are the notes inside a chord, and chromaticism is playing all 12 notes, the flats and the sharps, not just the 8 notes in a regular scale. So, but taking that stuff that I've learned from gypsy jazz, and then kind of just having that understanding of the architecture, and maybe leaving behind some of the more particular licks, and then approaching then an electric guitar with a little overdrive with that, it's not, I'm not going super crazy with fuzz distortion all the time or anything. But just then like the kinds of things that then can kind of come into my ears, I'm finding kind of it's refreshing improvisationally when I'm doing stuff with Pumpkin now. So
that's awesome. Okay, so we're getting close to the end here. Let me ask you a couple questions that kind of tie this thing together with kind of the overall project of the South Coast Artists Index.
Absolutely.
So you arrived in New Bedford like 28 years ago.
Yep.
Seems like a lot of your most formative musical years have been here.
I am the musician I am because I've played in Pumpkinhead when the first several years of Pumpkinhead, we used to rehearse 4 to 6 times a year, but we were gigging every week.
Yeah.
And so I learned by doing a lot of it. And again, being around musicians who are either better than you, know more than you.
And do you think that there's something about this region or that time period in this region or continually this region?
I think continually this region, because there have been, like, I'm sorry that I probably wouldn't have been really old enough to appreciate it had I been around, but like the jazz scene here in like the 70s into the 80s, like Bobby Green, and there was a lot of and it's been historically a huge number of great players, particularly, but not solely from the Cape Verdean community, both in kind of soul music and jazz music, like Rick Brito, who we lost several years ago. Jackie Santos played with the Beaver Brown Band, but I think he just quit the Beaver Brown Band. He's just teaching drums at Berkeley full time now. But just huge guys who were, all these, the band Tavares, which was basically kind of a full soul funk group. I think there's been a huge history of music here from all sorts of different traditions. And a lot of the newer stuff, like people who are more, like you and I, who are more transplants, I think are only more tangentially kind of aware of some of those deeper historical roots. And I've only learned through some of the other musicians who are older that I've gotten to know and who told me stories and whatnot.
We're not that young anymore, man.
I know. Then there's that. Well, that's why I arrived in the city when I was 24, and I'm 52 now. So I've lived here longer by far than any other place I've lived in my whole life. So, but I do think there's a certain kind of there's a synergy kind of thing that has been happening in New Bedford for quite some time, and I think through some of the stuff I was able to do with Pumpkinhead Ted, bands like the Dancing Dogs. Dancing Dogs has gone through so many permutations. I mean, when I first got here, the Dancing Dog, like Pumpkinhead was the redheaded stepsister to the Dancing Dogs when I first joined the group, and that the Dancing Dogs was the serious version of the music that a lot of those guys, like particularly Tom Short and Johnny Neiman, who were in Pumpkinhead, were trying to do. And like Jim Robitaille on guitar, who's like, I don't know of too many other people. Like you have to start talking about the Lages or the Vignolas or whatever to start talking about players who are potentially better than he is. And he was just, I think it may have been the first Dogs gig I ever went to. I think it was at the Main Event, which I don't think is there anymore on Union Street.
No, it's the hotel now.
Yeah, it's the hotel now. That's right. And this was just like there was so few there were so few. That was actually the other thing I'd say. Obviously, I think it's been a lot of the visual arts too. But like there used to be nothing. When I first got here, there was nothing downtown. And like what New Bedford has become as far as opportunity for artists, whether it be visual artists, musicians, other performative arts, has just, and I think a lot of us who got here early on saw the critical mass of possibility of like all the creative forces and artistry, and
that primordial soup's exciting.
Yes, and so that's because I came here to go to grad school with no intention of necessarily staying, and it was like, no, there's a lot of potential of what could happen in this town in the next 10, 20 years, and kind of here we are. But what was I going to say? There's just like some of the greatness of like, this is one thing I actually feel bad about, talking about getting older, is that I very rarely go to see my friends' my other friends who are musicians. I don't get to see the live music as much as I want to now, because unless I'm playing, I'm not going out to a bar usually, it's like I'm not, and so there's not a lot of opportunities, and that's really on me as much to take the opportunities to go do that stuff more. But I feel like there is a lot, there's always a lot going on, and it's actually hard to kind of catch everything.
I think that's true, and it's like nothing moves in a straight line, but it seems like there's always been Well, maybe not always. I haven't been here that long. Less duration than you. I got here
late 90s,
1999,
right?
something like that. But it always seemed like there was like a will, like a desire for something to be happening. There's always like there's a hunger for more. Like,
absolutely,
consistently.
Like, I mean, they had a very niche following, but like in the first few years you were here, like when Gala Jive Jet was playing new wave,
totally.
Like, who would have like those cats were playing some really serious music, and you know, they're all for the most part still around and still doing music, but like what the stuff they were pulling off in that band, and like I don't know of any other group like those days of the high days of the New Wave Cafe. I know you were talking with Ron about the New Wave Cafe. The Gala used to play 2 to 6 in the afternoon on a Saturday, and then come back and play 10 to 2, and like not really repeat songs too much, you know. And like they were jam songs, so there's some of them were 10 or 15 minutes long, but like that's like to gig for 8 hours in a day. that's like working a 16-hour regular job shift, because you are working really hard to do that. So, damn. Like think about that, like how fortunate I was to like be present. Right. You know, I wasn't taking part in, aside from being a really avid spectator. Because I really, you know, I'm friends with all those guys now, and I really appreciate all of them as people. But what they were, you know, all their paying gigs, they couldn't do it. I tried to get them to do a reunion for a party Trish and I threw last year, but no, they couldn't find a weekend that they all could. So
cool. Well, thanks, man.
Oh, you are welcome.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad.
Absolutely. And this will be put into the historical record, as
absolutely.
They say.
Absolutely.
I'm going to save this interview somewhere in the records at New Bedford Whaling Museum.
Excellent.
And
my pleasure and my honor.
Piece of this chapter, but there's a lot more of this chapter to come.
Absolutely.
So if you want to... You got any upcoming gigs?
Yes, actually. Well, since Pumpkinhead being the first band I was with, Pumpkinhead is very honored to be playing the Feast of the Blessed Sacrament on the main stage on Saturday, August 6th, which I think is pretty funny because I don't necessarily think of us as the entertainment for the feast, but we're going to do our best to entertain those who are there. I think that's the only... I think we might be playing out on the Cape mid-August, but I'm not sure on that date. But there's 2 Hot Club Cheese Roll gigs coming up in the next 8 days. We're playing at the Cushnet Public Library's concert series on Wednesday from 6 to 8 p.m., which is July 27th. And then we are doing a jazz brunch at the Inn on Shipyard Park on Sunday, July 31st. So
cool. There's a good chance that this will air after those gigs. Yeah. I send it over, and then they put.
Well, if the 2 other gigs, let's see, we're doing a gallery opening at Gallery X on, I believe it is September 3rd, if that's the Saturday, and then we have a jazz brunch at the Inn on September 4th, the next morning.
Awesome. So,
cool.
And Pumpkinhead Ted and Hot Club Cheese Roll.
Yep.
You guys playing both pretty consistently.
Consistently these days. So
keep an eye out for those gigs.
Cool. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks, man.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.